right. That was very loud. My bubbly was disruptively loud. All right. Oops. What do we do there? Okay. That is all my sounds for today. Okay. So obviously today we're going to continue talking about what the religious landscape looks like today. Again, lots of contradictory and confusing information. So if you're looking for like a straightforward story of, you know, the decline of religion, or, you know, religion's coming back, I think you've come to the wrong place. I have no such story to tell. That said, let's keep going. All right, this is an interesting question. How common is it for a youth convert, 16 to 26-ish, to remain a part of whatever religion they convert to? That's a really interesting question. I don't know that I have any particular data on this that I have seen. Part of it, as I would say, it depends largely on what religious group they convert to. Certain religious groups have much better retention than others. You know, Catholics, terrible retention. Evangelical Protestants, considerably better. Muslims, pretty good. You know, there's probably not enough converts to Judaism to even really come up with statistics on it. It's a very small religion. I'm trying to think of others. So probably the big ones that people convert to. I guess Mormonism. And I think Mormonism's retention rate for converts is pretty robust. Because like if you go through the process, you know, you're really likely to stay. And then of course you've got like, you know, fringier, more new religious movement-y types of groups and like sects. And those tend to have lower rates, like Jehovah's Witness, I think, has a pretty big drop-off at a certain point. But I haven't seen numbers on this in a long time, so I'm speculating a little bit. But I would say probably pretty strong for the most part. Okay. Interesting question, though. All right, what were we talking about last time? Okay, I think we did this. Okay, well, let's look at this. I think we were talking about this, right? And I think this is where we ended off. We were talking about, you know, the belief in the afterlife. And unfortunately, I think I need to reorganize some of these slides a little bit because I have other slides on this elsewhere, but we'll deal with that when we get to it. But again, right, pretty strong numbers of Americans believe, you know, essentially supernatural things, maybe unchurched supernatural things, but supernatural things nonetheless. And so, you know, like I say, it's weird for a secular nation. So if you wanted to make an argument against, you know, our inherited model of secularization or late secularization, right, these are pretty good numbers in that regard. Or, you know, if you want to make a case for, you know, no secularization or, you know, the secularization rest in peace, right? This is good data to do it with. Okay, so that said, I did say kind of earlier in the lectures that the growth of this group of people who consider themselves non-religious, right? The nuns, the nothing in particular, the no religion part of the cohort, on the whole seems to have plateaued. Now, that said, again, one of the things that's really, really likely to happen is that we are going to see, if not the numerical growth of the nuns, we're likely to see them grow as a percentage of the US population. Specifically, you know, for the following reasons, right? So, if we look at the youngest part of the cohort, and again, this is Pew, right? So this is Religious Landscape Survey data. it looks like RCS, but it should be an L. Our religious landscape survey. What do we see, right? Basically, young people, not just less religious in terms of identity, right? Though they definitely are, than the oldest part of the cohort, right? So these would be our oldest baby boomers. Well, I guess our oldest baby boomers in silence, right? So there, the youngest part of the cohort in the Pew Religious Landscape Survey, is 30 points more likely to identify as religiously unaffiliated. And they were, in terms of practices, right, far less likely, right? 46% say they're Christian versus 80. Qu'est-ce que j'ai fait? They pray considerably less, like half as much, and attend religious services about half as much as well. So what's likely to happen, right, with the nuns is as the more religious part of the cohort, the older part, dies, the percentage of people who are religiously unaffiliated, even if their numbers don't change drastically, are very likely to become a bigger proportion of the population just as the more religious part of the population sort of dies off. Okay. Yeah, so they're less likely to be replaced, right? As they have grown older, U.S. adults in all birth cohorts have become less likely to pray and less likely to become religious, right? And this is kind of what I was saying before, right? We sometimes, and Jasmine, who's not here today, she asked me a really good question after, right, which is a psychological theory of religion. And already there, we're on shaky ground. Because it's a psychological theory of religion, not a sociological one. But basically it posits that why people are religious is in order to, manage the existential dread that comes around dying. And, I guess if I'm wanting to be nice to terror management theory, I guess it has a certain virtue that, it might explain why as lifespans have gotten longer and the idea of death gets further away, people have potentially become less religious. But what you'd expect is as people get older, they would get they would get more religious. And like I said last time, that's actually kind of the opposite of what happens. As people kind of age through, they'll often get less religious over time. And again, it sort of hits a inflection point around your 50s typically, where once you're, if you were attending religious services, once your kids are gone and out of the house, or they're adults and they can make their own religious choices, you often will kind of fall away from religion, specifically because you feel like you did your job, you instilled morality, you took them to a moral instilling place, and then it's done, right? Okay. There's lots here, and I won't over-describe what's on this chart, but basically, right, we have all of our birth cohorts here, right, in terms of kind of ages. And what we see is over time, we see declines in religious behavior amongst all cohorts, right? So, percentage who prays has gone down since 2007 in all cohorts. Identify as Christian has gone down in all cohorts. And the share who is religiously unaffiliated has gone up in all cohorts, right? So, as people get older, they are getting less religious, not more. So take that, terror management theory. Okay, now that said, also, since 2020, particularly, right, so in this 6-year span since 2020, we're starting to see a bit more stability in terms of, some of these numbers as well. So they've kind of dropped, but you see these lines are pretty flat, right? Without over-describing everything, and especially here, right, like share who identify as Christian, among all our birth cohorts is pretty flat. I guess there's a lag on my pen. I hate it when my pen lags. Makes me sad. That usually means I have too much stuff open on my computer. I guess we'll just have to deal with it. Right, like let's say our all U.S. adults, right? That line looks really flat in that 6-year period. I guess who are our light, man, they could have picked better colors that are not so light blue. Guess 1990s, age, or maybe that's 1970s. Yeah, slightly darker. 70s, age 44 to 54, right? Actually kind of, went up a little bit. trying to find what this gray line is. Whatever, right? We see a couple lines that have gotten a little bit steeper, but most of them have declined, right? Oh, sorry, 70s, that one has 1970s, 44 to 54, have gotten a little bit more Christian. The ones that are 24 to 34, a little bit less. And then, this dark gray line here, which has to be our Gen Zers, have gotten a little bit more Christian as well. Okay, and the percent who are religiously unaffiliated, right? Similar kind of stuff. That would be your birth years, 2000 to 2006. Religiously unaffiliated actually went down a little bit for that youngest part of the cohort, but the rest of these lines are very flat, right? They're not moving a whole lot. So we are tending to see a lot more religious stability. So whatever big social movement happened, right, really between, say, about 1990, and say about 20, it's hard to write when you can't see what you're writing. About 2020, where you had this huge growth in the religiously unaffiliated, that seems to have sort of settled out, right? We're not seeing big growths or declines for any of these groups. Okay. Now that said, right, that is not to say that all is rosy when it comes to Christianity. Obviously, right, what we're seeing, bi-generational cohorts is pretty steady declines amongst a lot of metrics. And here we have a lot of kind of pretty interesting things, right? So, and again, pray daily, right? It's less than half. If we look at the youngest cohort, right? So those are your Gen Zers. Less than half compared to the oldest part of the cohort, and even, right, like up to people born in the 1960s, pretty steadily in the 50s, like slight declines, but ultimately not that much, right? You hit your really steep decline, with people born in the 1980s, so that's your millennials, and Gen Zers, right? And those are pretty steep declines in terms of that behavior. So, same thing here, attending religious services, not like declines through here, but the really steep decline is, again, in millennials and Gen Z. Same thing with belief in God with absolute certainty. And I'm going to say this because I hate this question on the Pew survey, and I wish they would get rid of it because I think it's really stupid. Because it's the qualifier with absolute certainty. I don't like this, and like I said, I know lots of priests and pastors, of many denominational stripes. And I would honestly say that I have, friends who are priests and pastors who would not answer yes to this question. Like, do you believe in God with absolute certainty? A lot of them wouldn't say yes either. So I think it's a really dumb question because absolute certainty is a really high bar. But whatever, I don't get to write the Pew survey and nobody asked me. But maybe they'll find this video online and they'll be like, oh yeah, that is a stupid question. Okay, probably not. Anyway, I don't like how this question is asked on the Pew survey, but we all have our quibbles. But again, right, in terms of belief in God with absolute certainty, pretty stable, from our pretty stable from our, baby boomers through to the Gen Xers. Once you hit millennials and Gen Z, right, we see really big drops. And again, with Christian identification, the drop is a little bit more consistent, but again, really sharp drop off. I guess these four drop off pretty sharply. Gen Xers, right, 10 point less likely than our kind of older boomers, and I guess younger boomers and very old Gen Xers to say they identify as Christian, and then we get into minority territory here. But again, if you want to look for stability, that profile for millennials and Gen Z looks really similar, as does our 44 and 43, right, in terms of kind of young millennials and older Gen Zers identifying as religiously unaffiliated. So, not a rosy picture, right? And especially these practice numbers, right, praying daily and attending religious services at least monthly, that suggests that, our younger generations are much more inactive religiously than older ones. Now, okay, what I'll say is that makes perfect sense too when we think of the social environment that Gen Z and millennials live in. It's one that is much more disconnected institutionally overall, right? Really with the, I don't want to put too much weight on Robert Putnam, but I'll mention him again. I mentioned him yesterday, but in a different class. Robert Putnam, right, he wrote this very famous sociology book called Bowling Alone. And one of the claims that he makes in the book is basically that as we've progressed generationally, one of the things that's happened is we've gotten more and more technologies, especially home entertainment technologies, that have kind of broken apart the social fabric, right? So while there used to be really robust institutional life, why? Well, not to put too fine a point on it, because people were really bored, right? And your house was kind of boring. So when your house was boring, you went out and did stuff with other human beings. So, you joined the bowling league, or you were part of a church because there were social activities there and people to talk to, and it was better, than sitting at home. Once we get, and Putnam in his book particularly points at cable TV, like in the 80s and 90s, as one of the things that sort of broke apart the social glue. We made the home very entertaining, and so people started staying home more, and you got this kind of social disconnection. People stopped showing up to a lot of social activities, right? And this, I think, is a pretty inarguable sort of point in the sense that we've definitely seen since the 1980s the social fabric really breaking apart, right? Less participation in sports, clubs, political parties, community associations, and all of those things across the board. And I think, in a sense, that might be what's reflected here, right? It's not just, I think if you looked at the participation of millennials and Gen Z in just about any institutional life, it would look pretty bad, right? It's just that we're looking at religion here, right? Like certainly they don't show up for political parties in major numbers, right, as a generational cohort either, or sports clubs, or a lot of things, right? There's even, and I've heard this kind of anecdotally, there's even like concern in professional sports that younger fans aren't being generated at the same rate as older fans. So there's concerns like in the NHL that the kids just aren't as interested as they used to be in the NHL. Now, could it be that the NHL charges what, like $400 a year to watch NHL games, and not everyone can afford that? So, screw that. Could be that, right? But also, there's definitely a kind of change. There's also, and I think, potentially the other thing, people don't sit around and all at home and all watch the sports ball of any kind. One person's watching sports ball, the other one is, scrolling on, Instagram, maybe in the same room, but not paying attention. But this is a kind of generalized concern, and you see it across a lot of demographics with, Gen Z and millennials not showing up for anything, right? And it's incredibly corrosive from a social perspective. Okay. I have a question slide. Ooh, we're getting into fun stuff now. Okay. I want to go back and see if there's any questions. There are not. Perfect. Didn't want to answer any anyway. Okay. Now, again, this. On measures of spirituality, the gaps between older and younger Americans are relatively modest, right? So here we see some pretty concerted gaps, in terms of things like belief and practice and identity. But when it comes to spirituality, far less so, right? So, people, have a soul or spirit in addition to their physical body, right? And basically, there's not a ton of difference across here, right? Like we have a range, I guess from 90, oops, that's 90 to 82, right? So we have an 8-point spread, which isn't nothing, but you kind of take the median of this, right? And it's a super high majority of all generational cohorts that believe that people have a soul or spirit in addition to their body, and that there's something spiritual beyond the natural world, right? So here, that there's a supernatural kind of realm. And again, you have what's our spread here? 84 to 71, right? Which again isn't nothing. It's more than a 10-point spread, but we're still in like, if we talk about our millennials, right? That's these two, and the beginning of Gen Z. You're talking 3/4 of people, right? Saying that there's something spiritual, and even with our Gen Zers, right? It's still 71%, right? A vast majority of them. So, again, okay, hang on. Let me make some notes, and let me make some observations here. If you wanted to make an argument for something like the inherited model or late secularization, right? This number is really good, right? That attends religious services at least once a month, and potentially, right, this not quite as good, because Bruce's claim is pretty maximalist, that you're going to have a 50% reduction, basically per generation, but you're definitely seeing a progression generationally downwards, right? So all of those things, could speak to secularization. None of this does, right? None of this speaks to secularization at all. If anything, maybe this is like the beginnings of secularization and towards people having a completely naturalistic worldview. But I think much more likely you could make a case here, of course, for something like, Rodney Stark's secularization, rest in peace, or neo-secularization, right? In the sense that something has shifted in terms of people's belief structure, right? Less likely to identify, less likely to believe in God with absolute certainty, but probably, and I think, some very individualized and personal religion, right? So you're probably seeing, you're definitely seeing secularization at the macro level, but possibly at the micro level as well, right? People increasingly might not be part of a formal religious organization, but still considering that there's something beyond, something spiritual beyond, what do they say? There's something spiritual beyond the natural world, right? And definitely, right, that people have souls, right? There's a kind of spiritual quality to things. I always love how these numbers don't make sense, by the way, because I'm like, okay, 82% of you believe that there's a soul, but only 71% of people believe that there's something spiritual beyond the natural world. The soul would be something spiritual beyond the natural world. So I love that these numbers don't make sense, right? Because human beings don't make sense. And I always like to point out how little sense human beings actually make. Like the closest to being like rational here is, and consistent is these guys, but there's still a 5-point gap, which I guess is like just outside margin of error. But yeah, I do find this really, really funny because I'm like, wouldn't a soul or spirit be outside, physically outside the natural world? But whatever, you do you. So these numbers often don't make sense because people don't think things through really clearly. Okay. Oh, this is the fun. So this, I don't know. To me, this is all fun, but I'm gonna get maybe a little bit spicy here because here's some of the. I would almost call this some of the weird stuff. Right? I'm going to call this some of the weird stuff. And some of the stuff that we're having a bit of trouble explaining. Okay, so what do we see here? We're going to look at this chart first, right? I'm going to tell you. So what we see here, right, and again, this is by kind of birth year, right? So again, we're looking at, different generational cohorts kind of over time. Now, what do we see? Well, so here we have our weekly attenders, right? So people who are attending weekly and those who never attend split up by sex, right? So men and women. Now, historically, and what you see is all the way through, for most generational cohorts, women have been more frequent attenders and they have been less likely to say that they never attend religious services than men, right? And there's a fairly substantial gap when we get to our oldest part of the cohort, right? We're talking just over 20% of women, and a solid, like 23, 24 or is that above 25? Oh, that's above 25, sorry. Like 26, 27% of men, right, saying that they never attend religious services, right, in the oldest part of the cohort. So a pretty substantial gap, right? And again, a pretty good gap in terms of weekly attendance, in terms of our age cohorts, right? Our oldest part of the age cohort, it's over 40% of women who attend religious services, weekly versus, just a hair around 35% of men. So a pretty solid 5% gap, right? And this holds true, though it kind of gets closer and narrower all the way to people who are born, through the 70s and into the 80s, and somewhere, right, so here's 1990, but somewhere around, let's say 1986, men, born after 1986 are more likely to attend religious services weekly than women are, right? And the same thing, right? We get our kind of crossover point, and it's kind of around, it's a little bit later here, because here's our crossover point, right? So now we're talking probably like late 1990s, women become more likely to be never attending than men. And again, this is interesting because it is the reversal of a really long-standing and very robust historical trend. Like, this has always been the case. Women have always been more religious than men. But what this might be suggesting is that some of our younger male cohorts might be trending in the direction of being more religious than women, right? So again, if you want to make a case, at least partially, for something like, self-limiting secularization, well, this might be interesting data to look at here, right? Because suddenly what we're seeing is a reversal of a trend. Now, only among men, right? And again, it's a pretty short time frame. Whether it's lasting remains to be seen. But we are seeing men attend more religious services, and become less likely to say that they are never attending. Okay. Now that said, and again, this isn't split by kind of age ranges. So this is just the whole part of the sample, like the whole sample, and these are two different samples, right? So this is the National Religion and Spirituality Survey from 2022, and this is, I think, the much more robust comparative election study data over here. Now, what do we see in our National Religion and Spirituality Survey from 2022? Okay, so women, and again, we're looking at whole sample here, so we're including the older part of the cohort, so it's a little bit less nuanced. Well, women are still more likely to say that they believe in God with no doubts, right? So considerably, they're equally likely to say they believe more than doubt. Women are 3% less likely to say they doubt more than believe. 5% less likely to say, that there's only some higher power. And what's the last one? Overall, still less likely on the whole, like through the whole population, to say that they don't believe in God at all, or God or some higher power, right? So, still there's a gap, right? If we take the whole sample of women, women are still more religious than men, but an interesting reversal happening amongst this youngest part of the cohort, where it looks like men are trending in the direction of becoming more religious than women. Okay, and yeah, so again, I got two different data sets here again. This is our religious landscape survey, and this is 2023-2024. And what we see here, again, is a little bit of narrowing in the numbers, right? The gender gap in U.S. religion shows signs of narrowing, right? So identify with a religion, it was, if we go back to 2007, right, 79 to 86, for a 7% gap. By the time we hit the last part of the sample, it's now a 5% gap, so that has closed significantly. Say they pray every day, a 4% change over this same period. Now, I will note that, those numbers have gone down considerably, right? So, these are way lower than they were back in 2007, right? By, 16 points for women and 12 points for men, right? So it's down overall, but the gap is closing, which is interesting as well. And yeah, belief in God or a universal spirit with absolute certainty. Again, we're now down to a 10% gap. It has gone down a little bit. Again, hate this question. I think it's really stupid. But yeah, I do think it's kind of a little bit ridiculous. Okay, why did I put that chart on? Oh, this is because it's split between men and women again. Okay, so our comparative election study data. Okay, what do we see here? I should probably read it before I tell you. Right, when we're looking at our religious composition, what do we see? Right, so for men, right, we're still looking at, and again, these are our two youngest parts of the cohort. Millennials are 1980 to 1994, and Gen Z is 1995 to 2010, roughly. Okay, so that's our kind of age ranges. Okay, so what's interesting? Well, if we look at this, right, amongst Gen Z in particular, let's say why that's interesting. So our religion numbers are kind of similar, right? So 20% of young men are Protestant, right? 24% of women are, so slightly more women Protestant than men. About the same percentage are Catholic, and right, this is roughly consistent across both cohorts. Other world religions, you know, men are, again, a little bit more likely to be other world religions, which I think is an immigration story, right? Men often come looking for work and either marry once they arrive in a place, or you know, they might bring wives over from where they're from after they're established. So we would sort of expect there to be more men who are part of other religions. Atheist agnostic, there's still a little bit of a gap, right? Men are more likely to say they're atheist or agnostic in both cohorts. But here in our nothing in particulars, right, and this is where I think it's really interesting, amongst both millennials and Gen Z, women are a little bit more likely to say that they have no religion, right? So that they are nothing in particular. So women are now sort of, you know, and again, same thing as what we're seeing here, right? Women are a little bit more likely to say that they are non-religious than men in these two birth cohorts, which is 100% super interesting because that has never been the case, right? It's always been men that are a little bit less religious than women. So things are shifting. Okay. Is the gender age chart amongst all religions or just Christianity? Right, so this one, this is religious attendance, right? So this is all religions, you know, and it's attendance weekly, right? So basically, yeah, there's no data controlled by religion here. All of this is obviously controlled by religion, but this is just identification, right? This is the religious composition. And again, what's really interesting here is that, okay. Okay, what else should I say here? Now, if you wanted to explain this with a theory of religion or secularization, you'd have to get creative, because I actually have no idea what theory explains this. You know, none of our standing theories, I think, really do a good job of explaining this kind of reversal or this movement to, men becoming slightly more religious than women. This raises a whole bunch of questions when it comes to, you know, theories of secularization, because I think we don't know what's going on. Now, potentially, if I was going to say, maybe what you could make an argument for here is something like rational choice theory, right? Because maybe men, you know, looking at their prospects in life and what rewards are actually available, maybe they're turning to religion and religious compensators to sort of, you know, meet the needs that they have, right? Or at least hope that those needs will be met at some point in the future. Rational choice theory, I think, is probably a good one. Maybe market theory, right? Maybe, in the sense that maybe religions are suddenly doing a better job of marketing to men, right? And certainly we've seen, you know, I think a lot of, you know, someone asked about red pilling last time and the red pill bros. And I do think, you know, maybe that red pill kind of movement in terms of religion a lot of which I think is gross and griftery. I'm thinking of like the Andrew Tates of the world, where Tate, I think says at least on the surface that people should become Muslim. Although, I don't know, of the Muslims I know, I don't think many of them think Andrew Tate would be a good role model, but that could just be me. Okay, so that said, right, maybe religion is doing a better job marketing or creating demand amongst men. So maybe, rational choice theory and market theory would be good at explaining this particular phenomenon. Okay. Okay, I answered this. Do I expect us to perfectly quote these stats on the final, i.e., do I hate you? I don't hate you. Yeah, do I hate you? I don't know. No, I don't hate you. But do I expect you to quote them perfectly? No. You should have some sense of them, right, and be able to put them in. And again, I'm gonna write this. I'm gonna write this on my next slide. The exams are open book. So you should be able to quote them pretty perfectly because you have your notes and slides and anything you need. And the next exam is 2 hours and it's the same number of questions. So you have even more time. I'll lavish you with even more time. 2 whole hours. Aren't I generous? Am I not merciful? To quote, a movie. You get it. You think it's funny. That's good. Okay. Yeah, so it's open book, right? So you have all of these things at your fingertips. Does it have to be perfect? No. Does it have to be competent? Yes. Can any of the graphs be tested on for the question? Oh, yes. I have a whole, like I said, I have a whole section in, like, if I look at my test bank, and I could show you, but I won't, and it's just called Graphs About Religion. And all of the questions are like, here's a graph. What does it mean? So maybe I do hate you. I don't know. Technically, I don't hate you. I must hate some past generation of students because I wrote those questions for them. But yeah, they're definitely there. And, there's lots of graphs. So yes, they're all testable. Now, there's some that obviously will I'll go back to that. Never mind, I kind of answered your question. I think it's related to that one, but I'll answer. So I do hate you. No, I hated last year's students because I wrote the questions then, and I haven't written any new ones yet. So it has nothing to do with you. You're just dealing with my trauma. So that's how it goes. Sometimes you have to fight the students of the past and their foibles. Okay. Do I hate you? Have I done anything so far to suggest that I hate you? Okay, is there a particular event or movement that could have led to this change? So I think, okay, I do want to answer this question in a more robust fashion because I do think it's an interesting question, but I'm going to go over here so I can write stuff because I like writing on slides. You may have noticed. Okay, so what is going on with men? Now, I think this is a really complicated question, and clearly you have to now come take sociology of youth with me to get the full answer to this question, except for some of you who've already taken it, in which case you already know. Men are not doing great, right? In a lot of ways, kind of post-1980s, men have struggled in work. They're increasingly struggling in school, right? They're, finding romantic partners. We have this big cohort of men who are finding it really difficult to find romantic partners, often because they're kind of gross. They watch too much porn. They don't exercise, right? They're not great prospects. They might not have great jobs. And women, for reasons that I think are self-explanatory, maybe don't find them that appealing. Who knew? But men are struggling, right? And I think likely, and again, right, it probably makes sense because this stuff really starts to bite. For that younger part of the cohort, our younger millennials and Gen Zers, that a lot of the challenges that men are facing are kind of accelerating, right? Deindustrialization being a big one, globalization has taken away a lot of manufacturing jobs and manual labor jobs. All of this has been really tough on men. And women have done, on the whole, better, right? Economically, educationally, and all of that jazz. So this may be, again, a sort of, maybe you want to put this in like, hey, you want me to throw out another theory that could be, because I just kind of thought of it. I hate this theory. Is this maybe a kind of, deprivation theory? I'm going to put like neo-deprivation theory, because I don't think it's like you could classically make the case that it's what Marx meant, right? Like the lives of the proletariat suck and they slave away all the time with barely enough gruel for them and their children. But it's a sort of different deprivation, maybe a deprivation of opportunity, a deprivation of kind of life chances, or being kind of stuck in a marginal place in society. And maybe that kind of deprivation is pushing them back. But I do think that's probably what's going on with men, is entirely that. Okay, what did I say about, sorry, is this, I think I explained this. Okay, these are good questions. What was that last part? I knew the thing about men and women always brings out some interesting comments. What was that last part about how rational choice theory could explain men being more religious? Well, right, like, again, if life isn't offering you a lot of rewards, right, and men are kind of struggling, right, they're having trouble getting jobs, starting families, right, moving into adulthood, launching, and again, I think there's ample evidence that this is the case, maybe then the rewards are scarce and unavailable. So what do you do in rational choice theory when rewards are scarce and unavailable? Well, you turn to religious compensators, right? So, you might not have a great existence or great prospects in the here and now, but maybe, you can be, one of the saints, or, you can, whatever any other religion sort of promises as rewards without going into it in too much depth, right? You might weigh those against like what your chances are. It's like, well, my life prospects aren't looking super great right now, but maybe religion offers some compensators, right? A good afterlife or something, right? Like that. Okay. There you go. These are the kinds of things you're going to have to think about on the exam, by the way. Because a lot of it is like, here's a phenomenon. What theory of religion or secularization explains this phenomenon that we're seeing? And, we got the landscape stuff, we got the nuns coming up, and, lots and lots more. Okay, well, actually, we are running out of time in the course, so the lots and lots more might be a bit of an oversell. Okay, so, what do we have here? Okay, again, we got our data from the comparative elections study. Here, broken down into different waves of the CES, right? And again, split between men and women. Okay, so what do we see? Well, I think pretty consistently as we go through, the different years, what we're looking at is, a decline in Protestantism. And here's, I wish the CES data, this is my one mild complaint with the CES data, which I think is really, really good and it's really fun to work with. They don't split mainline Protestant and evangelical out into two different categories, which I don't like. I prefer when we kind of split them out because I think they're very different things. But yeah, our Protestants, right, have declined from 38% amongst women to 25% among women, and 32% among men to 23%. And they're almost even, right, in the most recent wave of the CES that we have, right? There's not a huge difference between men and women. There was a much bigger one in that 2008 data. Catholics, apparently men, this caused a little bit of a huna in some of the people looking at this data with the CES, because it's like, holy, what the heckle? Did a whole bunch of men and women just decide to convert to Catholicism in like the 2023 wave of the CES? I would say, because right, it was kind of sitting between like 24, especially for men, 24. I guess in 2016 it was about 28, but then it dropped, and it's like, okay, this is just weirdness in the data, right? This is where the data probably just grabbed a few extra Catholics and just kind of, it goes up and down, and you see the natural variance, right? Both of them have kind of hit highs similar to that in past waves. So no, it's not a huge conversion, but there's a lot of really conservative Catholics, especially on YouTube, that are like, people are converting to Catholicism in droves. They're not, right? There's no evidence of that. But, in this wave of the data, it just happened to grab a lot of Catholics. What I do think is kind of interesting here, right, is sort of relative declines. I guess, back here, or stability and a little bit of decline between these different waves, and especially from like here to here, right? It looks like men, moved out of that atheist agnostic category a little bit, between these waves, right? So 2020 and 2022, really high identification for men with atheist and agnostic, with about a quarter of men saying that they were there. And then, dropping to kind of low in that last wave of the CES data. For women, right, what's interesting, I think, is the really steady and kind of, let's say, linear progression of nothing in particular, right? It's grown pretty considerably through this period. I need to know what time it is. Okay, I still have lots of time. Okay. So again, we're starting to see some differences, and I'll say nothing in particular, for men has remained a fairly unpopular choice, right? And it hasn't moved a lot. So, at least in this kind of data set, men were much more likely to be atheist agnostic, right? It's kind of evened out now between men and women, but men remain about as likely as they were in 2008 to say that they're nothing in particular, while women have become somewhat more likely to do so, right? So again, we're seeing this kind of weird inversion where it looks like there's some shifts in things going on. And again, just to be consistent and to tell you, my pet theory, again, we've got, other world religions in here, right? So, clearly more men than women, and again, that's probably an immigration effect. Okay, it's likely not also a lot of, you could interpret this, though I don't think you should, as a lot of young men converting to, say, like Islam. I don't think that's the story here. I could be wrong. All right. So many things all the time. Okay, I promise the next unit has more words and fewer graphs, though still some graphs. Okay, so how important is religion to you among millennials and Gen Z, right? And here, what do we have? Not important at all, to very important. And of course, here what do we have? We have how important is religion to you by gender, right? So again, interesting things to kind of look at. All right, so overall, right, and again, we can look at different waves. What we see is, for millennials, way more, I guess a little bit more, back in 2016, thought it was very important. And we've seen, I guess a bit of growth in not important at all. Not too important seems pretty consistent, as does, these numbers all look pretty consistent as well across the board of somewhat important. So we've seen a bit of shrinking in terms of very important, right? Those numbers have gone down a little bit, and not important at all has gone up a little bit. Okay, now, and yeah, it's about a third, or a little bit less than a third of millennials and Gen Z who say religion is not important at all. And it's still about like half-ish, a little bit more than half that say it's either somewhat important or very important, right? So we've got like a 50-50 split between not important at all and not too important and somewhat important to very important, right? Okay, now for men and women, right, have we seen shifts? Well, I mean, roughly speaking, right, so in this data, if we look at our compositions by generation, right, we don't have the, we just have here from 2020 to 2023 in the data, not going all the way back to 2018 and not broken out by year. But basically what do we see? Well, for men, both Gen Z and millennials, pretty consistent and very important. Gen Zers apparently think, slightly more of them than millennial men say it's somewhat important, which might be, again, pointing to something, right? Maybe there's a little bit of a religious resurgence among Gen Z men. It's a small number though, so it could be margin of error. You know, more millennials than Gen Z men say it's not important at all. And that's a pretty solid, 5-point gap. So I would say beyond our sort of margin of error. And now for women, right, similar numbers, right, though millennial women apparently are slightly more likely to say that it's not, or it's very important, so they're slightly more religious. Not important at all, the generations are pretty close, right? Not a lot of difference in any of these other categories. And, between the two groups, men and women, they're pretty similar here, right? Gen Z, women and men are both about 27% say it's very important. So again, a little bit less stark in terms of some of the numbers we've seen so far, but still, some meaningful and interesting differences. Okay, this chart. Here, I'll summarize this really quickly. And again, this is our National Religion and Spirituality Survey. And just across the board, right, when it comes to spiritual activities, right, women are in brown, or what color is that? I'm sorry, I'm male and colorblind. What color is this color? I don't know. It's greeny brown. Olive? Would you say olive is the correct one? Okay, olive versus blue. Okay. I'm, like I said, technically colorblind as it goes. So, on every measure other than acts of protest, right? So men more likely to do acts of protest, but acts of service, art, attending religious or spiritual groups, attending religious services, right? Being in nature, communicating with ancestors, fasting, only 5% on either side, so not a big deal. Meditation, offering and donation, okay, that one's the same as well. And I guess tarot and fortune telling. Apparently men are 1% more likely to be doing the fortune telling. But everything else, right, women, and this one, right, prayer, wow, big gap there. Women are much more likely to be engaged in these spiritual activities in the previous week than men are, right? So we've got like a few evens, and just like a few evens and a few very small differences where men are slightly more likely to do acts of protest and tarot cards, but the rest is all pretty much the same. Okay. All right, this is where I told you. And again, if we want to talk, inherited model or late secularization, right? These graphs are going to largely obviate against those two arguments and look at something that's much more like, secularization, rest in peace. Why? Well, because, this is the, do you believe in the afterlife, or that there's life after death, right? And this is from the GSS, right? So again, I think pretty robust data. And what do we have, right? So this is by education level. So if you're ever wondering if education makes a difference, it does a little bit, but not as much as you might think, right? So if we see our high school or less, right? And again, this is by birth year, I think. Yes. Oh no, this is tracking through time, right? Okay, relatively consistent, right? So if we look at belief in life after death over time based on education levels, what we see is these lines are pretty flat, right? There's been some variances, right, where say our grad school graduates were less likely to believe in an afterlife back in the 1970s. And then, they're kind of the same as everybody else. And sitting at, about 80% saying they believe in life after death. So, people who've gone to grad school and college are basically just as likely as everyone else, in the most recent wave of the General Social Survey to say they believe in the afterlife. And for some reason, people who did some college are a little bit more likely, right? So very much majority territory, but it's only like a 4 or 5 point spread. So not huge, right? So does this look like secularization? Here we've got a really broad wave, right? We've got a 50-year time frame, right? So we've got half a century of data, and in that half a century of data, it's actually gotten slightly more likely to believe in the afterlife for most of these groups, right? Certainly for our grad school and high school or less. I guess like college grad is about the same, and some college has gone up a little bit, right? So over this 50-year time period, have we secularized? Well, at least not on this measure. So I think we're going to give a great big green check mark, because we can, to secularization, you rest in peace, right? To that no secularization. This does not look like secularization, right? This looks like a very steady, still pretty religious population in the US. All right, do you believe in life after death? Share saying yes, right? So this is the whole sample. And right, this is the brown line is the mean, and the bumpy line, right, is obviously where the different data points is. But again, overall, pretty flat, right? Not a lot of change over time. It was actually lower, right around here. And I guess right around here. So in the 80s, and it's a little bit higher, in the present. So again, you can make an argument with this data that probably secularization isn't happening, right? That there's a really weak evidence here for secularization, and certainly for something like late secularization, right? You should see declines in this across the board as those younger cohorts come into the model, and you're not seeing it, right? So again, Taro is great for getting someone's number, by the way. Not useful information for me, but I'm sure there's some people here that appreciate it. What would cause people to believe more in the afterlife after going to school? Doesn't more university education make people less religious? Oh, that is such a great question, and I'm so glad you asked it. The answer to that question is it used to, right? If we go back to, say, the and again, it's right here, and you kind of see it. But it used to, but it didn't, not as much. I don't even think I have this data in this. I could add it for next time, but I'm sure you don't want more charts. So I'll just tell you, and maybe I do have it, because I forget what charts are in here after a certain point. Okay, so how to put this? It's weird. It used to, and it doesn't anymore. And actually, if you look at it today, and again, this might shock the question asker, because I know exactly why they're asking this question, because this is, right, okay, so this argument, right, this what we're seeing here, what you're doing is you're essentially parroting the inherited model of secularization, right? Modernity is, toxic to religion, right? And it's deeply built in. And what is one aspect of modernity? Education, right? Growing education for a population. Now, here's what I'm going to say. It's really complicated. I'm going to give you two answers, and I'm going to tell you they make absolutely no sense together. So, in America, no. It's actually the opposite of what you think. The people most likely to attend religious services on a weekly basis are people who've been to grad school. By a slim margin, right? The least likely in America to attend religious services weekly are people with a high school degree or less. So in the US, at least, it looks like the less educated you are, the more likely you are to be non-religious, right? And that's very robust. And again, I don't think I have it in here. I could add it, but you already hate me enough for my endless row of graphs. So why bother? I know where the data is, and I know what it looks like, right? But in America, grad school, if you've been to grad school, more likely to go to religious services on a weekly basis. Now, if you're in Europe, it's the opposite, right? The least likely people in Europe to go to religious services on a weekly basis are those that have been to grad school, and the most likely are those that have a high school education or less. So, what does that mean? I don't actually know. It likely means, and here I'm guessing, it likely means that there's other cultural forces other than education that are sort of affecting religious service attendance, right? And that different cultural patterns or even different cultural attitudes probably are pushing people in one direction or the other, right? But yeah, this is the inherited model all over, just in a sneaky form, right? You're parroting it in a sneaky form, like not being like modernity's toxic, you're like, knowledge is toxic, but that's not true, right? Or at least it's not universally true. It's true in one context, but it isn't true in another. Like I said, if I haven't stressed enough, none of this data makes sense consistently, right? It's all when you look at enough of it, you just come to realize it's all an absolute mess, and it doesn't tell a consistent story, and no theory fits all of the data. Okay. What would cause more people? I mean, that can't be it, right? Because actually, when it comes to like higher education in Europe, you see exactly the same pattern, right? The more education you have, the higher your socioeconomic status, right? Highly educated Europeans are still those who are the highest earners in European societies, right? Uni also doesn't cure existential dread. If anything, it causes it when you find out your enrollment period for next year starts incredibly late this year. So, you know, that's super fun. It's all the buzz for the professors too. Don't worry, nobody likes it. And I believe the undergrad chair just told me, yeah, nothing works around here anymore. So, don't feel bad if that's your impression. Yeah, so, I mean, do we need to know the best theory for each chart? I mean, you're going to have to answer questions about particular charts. So, you might want to think about how these charts fit into these theories. And I may ask you about one that I've told you a theory for, and I may not, right? It may be totally different and fun, or I may ask all sorts of questions. Mwahaha, ha 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 ha, ha ha ha. Sorry, my evil cackle needs some work. I can actually do it much louder, but with the microphone on, it sounds bad. Okay, so, here, what do we have? Factors that predict not believing in the afterlife. Okay, so obviously the most likely one, right, with the strongest correlation to not believing in the afterlife is having no religion. So that's a thing. The next highest one, right, and again, these are ranges. So it's a pretty big range on all of these. Being liberal, right? So politically left-leaning, again, liberals less likely to believe in the afterlife than conservatives. No surprise there. Being male, right? Men are apparently less likely to believe in the afterlife. Super fun. Age, right? Being a little bit younger here makes a difference, more likely. Now here, education, right, actually has a negative correlation, right? Negative correlation with not believing in the afterlife. So again, this is like, I would say this is like a bullet to the brain for the inherited model, right? Obviously, and sorry for that graphic description, but here you can take it around to the back of the barn and shoot it. Because this definitely doesn't make sense, right? This is not what we expect at all. And same thing with income. Like, income is like right on the bubble, right? It either has 0 or a little bit positive, a little bit negative. So it doesn't seem like income really matters here. And then, being white, although, look at the range on this, right? From either mildly positive, where here we actually hit statistical significance at the outside of the range, 0.5 being what we think of as statistical significance, to, just absolutely a nothing burger and slightly negative at the other end of the range. So, again, really confusing data, I will say. Do you believe there's life after? Oh, this one is my favorite. Even amongst our non-religious, right? Do you believe in life after death? And if you want some really confusing data, we're going to talk about the nuns later, right? I have a whole unit on the nuns. The nuns are their own hot mess of inconsistency. And I may have a rant in there, sort of Inigo Montoya, like you keep using that word. I don't think that word means what you think it means, right? So, because there's some stuff with the nuns where I'm just like, I don't know, guys. I don't know what to tell you anymore. But, again, our general social survey data, when it comes to the nuns, what you see is, so amongst our non-religious respondents, even amongst our non-religious respondents, right, in the latest wave of the data, they've actually become more likely to say that they believe in life after death right? And it's now in majority territory, right? If we go back to, the 1970s, right, 73, it was just a little bit below 50%, and it kind of like stayed kind of in that range largely through the 1990s, right? After which point, people who say they're non-religious start believing in life after death in, pretty strong majority territory, right? Up to around 2/3, right? So again, does this make sense? Is this secularization? Are the nuns really secular, right? Because we always, almost all the data, right, when people talk about this is like, wow, America's secularizing super fast, right? Look at the growth of the nuns. But this is what the nuns actually think. They think there's life after death. That's a religious belief. It's a spiritual belief. And so it makes no sense, right? You say you have no religion. You keep using that word. I don't think you know what that word means. Again, there's a ton of this when it comes to our non-religious participants. Their beliefs are really, really inconsistent. I remember this too, because I had a few years, I guess, like 11 years ago, one of my close friends died, right? And he said he was an atheist, all good, so we did this, non-religious funeral service. And I remember like his relatives, right, giving little eulogies and it was like, oh, we know he's in a better place. And I'm like, okay, interesting. Like all non-religious people, not church attending, right? Nothing like that. We know he's in a better place. And my thought, because I'm a sociologist, this is what you think at funerals, is like, what better place? Right? You don't believe in anything. And that's fine. I don't expect people to be perfectly consistent. I think his sister was like, because everybody remembered him as like a 6-year-old, and he liked Ninja Turtles. So it's like, hey, you're up in that turtle blimp in the sky. I'm like, that is the most interesting vision of heaven I've ever heard. Like that it's like the blimp from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and that's where you go when you die. I'm not sure I'm on board for that one, but okay. You do you. I'm like hanging out with the turtles. What a cool vision of heaven. Anyway, I'm just ranting at the moment. Oh, okay. This one. How am I doing on here? I gotta check how many slides I have left. Where is my slide select? I have too many slides left. Okay, well, we'll do what we can until Erica throws a book at me and kills me for talking too long. She's getting more violent over time, by the way. You didn't know that? No, she's not. I'm just kidding. She hasn't given me the kill switch in a little bit, in a little while. Okay, so, all right, let's talk modernization of beliefs. And here, I've got the fun, sort of like easy to read version here. You can go read it from Maclean's. This is an academic paper. It's a Canadian paper. And it's a really interesting one. Because one of the arguments that we'll often get, right? And again, you can think of like Stark in the Churching of America for sort of making the opposite argument to this, is that what religions need in order to survive is to modernize their beliefs, right? And it's usually around things like LGBTQ rights, the role of women, and those sorts of things. But what often goes along with that is, how should we put it? I guess the way that Stark sort of puts it in the Churching of America, right, is one of the things that religions tend to do over time, right, is become sort of more worldly and accommodated. And so, they tend to shed a lot of their supernatural elements, right? Because only rubes believe in the supernatural, apparently. And as you get more proper and you found institutes of higher learning and all of that stuff, you shed some of those beliefs, right? And you can look at something like, perhaps like the United Church of Canada or the Anglican Church or the Lutheran Church in this sort of respect. So, a lot of them have shall we say, modernized beliefs, moved a little bit away from the supernatural, and though this study doesn't show it, moved in the direction of kind of positive on kind of contemporary social values, right? Now, a pretty consistent body of literature, of which this is just one example, and the class before us apparently gets out 10 minutes before the deadline because the screen started shaking, and I can hear them. The idea that modernizing beliefs is the way for religion to survive, right, is a very popular one. It has a very, very long history, right? But what does the data actually show? All right, so this study, right, and again, this was a Canadian study, showed that if we looked at Protestant churches, right, Anglican, United, Presbyterian, and Lutheran churches, the ones that were growing versus the ones that were shrinking had very different belief systems. Okay, so what do we see? In growing churches, right? The beliefs of the Christian faith need to change over time in order to be relevant, right? What do you see? Well, less than half of their congregations believe that to be true. And when it comes to churches that are shrinking, it's 69%, right, who think that it's true. That's either strongly agree or agree, right? Amongst those that are growing, right, so the churches that are growing, 0% of their clergy believe that. 0 is a very small number. It's actually not a number at all. But, essentially none of their clergy believe that. And amongst churches that are shrinking, right, amongst their clergy, right, it's similar to their congregations, right, really strongly believe that, you need to modernize your beliefs. So, if you want to be growing, it's probably for the best, if you're just looking at a growth standpoint, modernizing your beliefs doesn't align with social values, probably not a good idea, because you're more likely then to be in the shrinking category. Okay, God performs miracles in answers to prayer, right? Interestingly, when we look at shrinking churches, less than half of their clergy, right, so pastors, priests, whatever, believe that. And only a very small minority agree with it strongly, right? Now their their congregations much less likely on both. Well, I guess, clergy 100% believe it on the growing side. On the shrinking side, 44% believe it. Now, even on the shrinking side, more of their congregations believe that miracles happen. Again, what do people turn to religion for, right? It's religion, right? To use Rodney Stark's aphorism, right? People want religion out of religion. If this isn't true, why are you showing up to a church? Okay, Jesus rose from the dead with a real flesh and blood body, leaving behind an empty tomb, right? And again, it's a bare, this is core Christian belief, right? Shrinking churches, it's a bare majority that agree with that, versus, in growing churches, a vast majority. And then, amongst congregations, again, different kinds of views, but the more supernaturally oriented churches seem to be growing, right? And again, it's very important to encourage non-Christians to become Christians, right? So should you try to get people to convert? Well, and not surprisingly, shrinking churches tend not to believe that at a much higher rate. And you'll see, right, and I do find this is lovely. 0% of the clergy in shrinking churches thought it was important, right? Half of them said they strongly agree. Half of them said they just agreed. And then, it was 100% for growing churches. Not surprisingly, if you think it's important for people to convert, you're more likely to try to get them to convert, right? Okay, so what's the takeaway here? In mainline churches, right, the ones that diverge broadly from traditional Christian teachings actually tend to decline, not grow, right? So being more LGBTQ affirming, more pro-abortion, right, actually doesn't seem to help you, right? It actually, in a lot of ways, probably drives people away. Those that are orthodox, right, tend to grow. And I would say this tends to exist in Catholicism as well, though it's a little bit harder to track because there isn't as stark a divide, right? And what's the truth? Heterodox churches, right? So the ones that are more, this bottom band, they're growing older, right? The average age of them now, I don't know in Canada, I'm sure it's the same. In the US, it's into the 60s and 70s for churches that are more heterodox. The more orthodox ones are still growing older, right? They're not getting any younger, but they're growing older at a slower pace. My PC battery is about to run out. Let me just finish up with this, and then we'll pick it up on Tuesday with the next slide. But I'll finish this, right? Okay. ages, right? So when we talk about our growing churches, right, they are still pretty old, right? A good chunk of them are 41 to 60, right? That's blue. And a good chunk of them are over 60. But they have more young members, right? And certainly, right, when we look at our declining churches, right, they're very old, right? They're really, really old. There's a lot of white there. Okay. And then things like, frequency of prayer, right? At growing churches, either several times a day or at least daily, basically everyone. And here, much less likely that they're engaging in religious practices regularly, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on here, but I think the takeaway is growing churches tend to be more traditional, they tend to be more orthodox, and that probably plays a role in their growth. Though, to be fair, you could also argue, and I know Joel Thiessen at Ambrose does, Ambrose University, I talked about him last time, argues that what's happening here with the growing churches is it's largely refugees from the declining churches, sort of leaving, their, and when we see the mismatch here between like clergy and congregations, that mismatch causes a lot of people in those kind of shrinking congregations to then kind of throw up their hands and be like, well, I don't agree with what this person says, and they go look elsewhere. So it's probably not that these growing churches are attracting like brand new converts. It's probably a lot of church refugees from these declining and collapsing denominations. Oh gosh. Okay. Are men more religious simply because it's more advantageous for them? I think you'd have to make a case for where the advantages are. Maybe you're making a case that women are oppressed in religion. I think you'd then have to sort of make a case as to why, we have this historical reversal and why men in the past weren't as religious. So I don't know that explains it. Deprivation theory aside, in most religions, a key to greater authority and respect is just being a man. There's possibly that, right? There's possibly that, although, I don't know that would explain it. And again, you have to sort of think, why has that historically then meant men were less religious? That's a tough one to explain with that as well. Is the afterlife directly connected to religion? Well, here what I'll say is it's a spiritual belief, right? It might not be a religious belief, but it's definitely a spiritual belief, because you're generally dealing with some kind of like Cartesian dualism, right? You're a spirit that then goes on to an afterlife. And it's definitely not a secular belief, right? Because if you're talking sort of what's predicted by like the inherited model or late secularization, you're tending towards like metaphysical naturalism, right? That there is nothing beyond the natural world. And so that certainly doesn't fit that pattern either, right? Like you should be moving to a, is there any evidence for an afterlife? Not really. And if it isn't evidence, right, it's not rationalist, right? And it can't come from science. So it kind of fails those aspects of that modernity theory. So yeah, sometimes you have beliefs in the afterlife that aren't connected to religion. There are boutique ones like the turtle blimp in the sky. That said, it's still a spiritual belief at the end of the day. Okay, I've gone to the buzzer. Let's stop here. Okay. I'll take some of this out. I'm repeating myself apparently. Okay, off we go. No.